I'd like to welcome the rest of you to join this conversation as well. And I believe we also have people online. Who's monitoring the online? Okay, thank you. Good. First of all, in the room, questions or comments? Yes, thank you. Would you?
Do I need a microphone?
Yes, and would you introduce yourself, please?
Thank you. Richard Jordan. I'm the Dean of Non-Governmental Representatives at the United Nations and a member of the Commons Cluster of Civil Society, with a question for Peter. You had a slide that showed the time frame for communities and corporations to form commons, I believe. Why was Tanzania the country that had the shortest time frame? Thank you.
Peter, do you want to? That's a pretty specific question, so why don't we let you take that?
So thank you very much. I talked a lot about the complex and burdensome procedures that communities have to go through, but that's not the case across the board. Tanzania has, I think if I remember correctly, 4 or 5 steps. And it is not surprising to me that 85% of the villages actually have a certificate of village land as a result, I think, as a result of that. If you look at some of the other countries, as neighboring Uganda, I don't believe a single community has secured a title there, in part because the procedure is so complicated. So I think it's just an endorsement. I should have mentioned it, but it's an endorsement, I think, of a streamlined, quick procedure.
But just to add, of course, a lot of land is not in it, because that's a little bit what you said earlier, what is in the village land and what is in the general land, and I think a lot of the valuable comments are outside,
So
to my
maybe,
knowledge.
Yeah, just maybe one of the things in Tanzania is that the village acquires a certificate of village land, which is what, 70% of the country. And then to document customary allocations within the community, those communities can acquire what's called a CCRO, which is a certificate for household land. And I think there was early on a feeling that while the certificate of village land aren't considered collateral for loans, there was a feeling that CCROs would be. They're not, I think, for the most part. One of the interesting things you're seeing, though, in Tanzania is that they're exploring with the use of the CCRO, which was meant for individual land, to enclose the commons within the community land. So there is, and that's, I think that's a recognition that used and occupied land is less insecure than the common property, which is seen as underutilized and therefore vacant and available for investment purposes. And so there, particularly amongst the pastorals in the north, you're beginning to see an effort to try to also formalize the commons within village land.
Thank you very much. My name is Chris Hagedorn. I'm a private consultant in food and nutrition security. And my comments, well, actually, I'd like to take the UK model and suggest that before I make any comments that there be no opposition. I think that's a great model. My comments and questions are really about the urgency. And I'm struck if the phrase, the tragedy of the commons was coined in 1833, and you didn't have a law in place till 2006. That really begs the question of urgency. One of the things that when I was at the State Department we launched was a focus on fisheries, the common of overexploited fisheries in the Caribbean, and the idea with $5 million, working with the World Bank, working with FAO, working with several regional groups, was to come up with innovative pooled insurance risk tools that would address what we all knew is coming and coming in more frequency. It's higher intensity storms, greater droughts, more damage, more climate change driving emigration from Guatemala, as the Washington Post just wrote. So the question I have, and I haven't heard anybody talk about it, planning for what we know is going to be greater disaster. All the people you mentioned that are captured, whose interests are going to be lost or damaged, they're not going to make changes easily. But planning ahead for what we know will be damaged is the best way to act, in my opinion. But I don't hear anybody talking about what those future models are. Now, we did work with the World Bank. This was fisheries. We knew what the climate risks are, the intensified storms. We tracked that. We pooled funding, and a quick payout would go to countries who bought the policies. So are there similar things in the land area, forestry, et cetera? Because I think that's quite important to address action rather than the compilation of data and studies, which, as WRI is doing, are great, but not enough. Thank you.
That's a provocative question, and to give the panelists a minute to think about it, Amanda, if you can give it to Marc Cohen behind. And
Thank you. So I guess that counts as my introduction too. Thank you, Ruth. I'm Marc Cohen from Oxfam. My question for Professor Veit, and he'll get that joke. The differences between communities and companies, to what extent are those formalized in the sense that they go to different agencies and follow different procedures, and to what extent is it simply a reflection of the power imbalance? Maybe you said that because it sounded like it was mostly the latter, but I wasn't sure if you said there's a different agency that they go to. And then I also wanted to ask John Powell, well, first of all, thank you very much for 900 years of English history. But since we're not, as Ruth said at the beginning, talking about Hardin that much, I mean, he talked about the tragedy of the commons in terms of there were too many people and destroying the resources, and so we should have lifeboat ethics and, I guess, get rid of most of the people. But it seemed to me the solution up until the mid-19th century was partly to make the commons into uncommons through enclosure, and the last person besides you that I remember talking about the Enclosure Acts was Karl Marx and Das Kapital.
okay, is there a, yeah. Again, we'll give another minute to think, but Sophie.
Yeah, hi, I'm Sophie Theis from IFPRI as well. Thanks for great presentations. These were very thought-provoking. I had a follow-up question on this issue of length of communities registering their lands. It seems like if one of your recommendations is to try to simplify this process of community land registration, it would help to know more about why it's so long, what the historical, political, social drivers of this might be, and if there's any practical reasons that they're very long, or if it's mostly, seeming to reflect bias or discrimination against communities' land rights. And then kind of related to that, I was just wondering if there's, I guess if there's any argument for the practical reason for these being so lengthy, if there's any correlation between the length of registration processes and the strength of rights that come out of that, or if it's just, how do you interpret that?
Okay. Did anyone else come up with a good answer on the planning for disasters and what future models as we look ahead? I do have a thought on this, but okay, good.
It's not something I've looked at in much detail. There's a huge amount of consideration, reports, sort of thinking about how you deal with future climate change, for example, especially in relation to ecological values. In terms of the commons in England, the focus has been very much on working out how to create rules and management systems that are flexible and adaptable, and how to create governance structures that can be easily adapted and allow for rule changes. One of the big problems we've had on commons is it was up until 2006, it was a very rigid process of agreeing on how to manage the common. They had to have unanimous voting, unanimous agreement from all the rights holders on what to do, which of course basically meant in many cases nothing happened. Things didn't change because of the difficulty of doing that. Under the new process, if commons associations adopt, get an establishment order and get government support to create new rules, they can engage in majority voting. So that gives them much more flexibility, much more adaptability, that hopefully could deal with something like the impacts of climate change. But I don't think the commoners themselves are actually thinking about it. They're mostly wondering about, next year, how are my sheep going to do? What's the weather going to be like next year? Am I going to make enough money? What's going to happen to the price of lamb on the market? That they're much more immediately concerned with, financial survival. Can I just say, well, first of all, does that answer your?
Well, I would think there's an added reason to have insurance models in that case.
Well, yes, I think that largely comes through agricultural policy. There's a lot of scope for farmers to get various kinds of risk insurance, at least within Europe. And I know there are European. There's activity within the EU to look at risk insurance.
Just to build on your comments, I think these type of issues, like I say, on unanimous decision is a problem. I think having a list of these things is quite important. So I think for Indonesia was also at one point a kind of proposed legislation even there, which has the same thing, which in a way it will block. So if I say do no harm, knowing what are because it really goes to these things, having somewhere those things there, well, really don't go there because it may sound so great because it's so participatory, but how it then blocks. So that type of knowledge should be out much more there. So I think on the commons, on the fisheries, I don't know enough. I think about insurance, again, I would say what is happening in the World Bank is more on smallholders insurance. It's not really about the commons, except for the adaptability. I mean, that is the key thing, and they're often in that type of drylands. I just want to say something on institutions too, because I would say that is also the same with smallholders and large farms. It's a bit like, so if you then also build the institutions which are effective for the commons and for the smallholders, if that is happening, because I know why that goes much faster for. So it's a bit like, well, knowing all that. And I would also like to say, like on the streamlining, this is not only for the commons a problem. If you look at you try to register customary rights, not even a common, how long, how endless, how impossible that is. So it's almost across, it's not unique to the commons, although it's maybe they're more visible. It's a general problem. For all kinds of reasons, it's just endless.
So I want to pick up on a couple of thoughts on the insurance is much more difficult for commoners to receive because you have to have a legal identity to receive through formal insurance. Having said that, I think there are lessons from the commons about other types of planning for disasters and mutual insurance. Look at the history of pastoralists. And in fact, the more rigid your boundaries are, the more susceptible you are to the disasters. Pastoralists they have these mutual access rights, and flexibility is actually designed to deal with highly variable ecological conditions, and when you impose rigidity on it, you make them more vulnerable. But having said that, there's also an important role of the commons in reducing disasters. So, for example, BBC just a couple weeks ago had a thing about a mapping program that coastal communities and the fishers in the coastal communities are doing to map the mangroves, because the mangroves are essential to prevent disasters, but they are part of these commons that are vulnerable. So I think we need to also look at how the commons contribute to reducing disasters by creating some of that flexibility. John, you had the question from Mark also.
Yes, about enclosure as a means of overcoming the tragedy of the commons. Was that the question? Yeah. To reduce it. Yeah. Well, of course, yes, enclosure did take place over a long period, and a lot of land was enclosed, a lot of farmland. But that was, I think, the driving force there was agricultural revolution, agricultural change, and it wasn't a matter of the land. The land could be more efficiently, it became clear the land could be more efficiently used. It could produce much more. It could deal with new ways of farming if it was enclosed. But despite that, we still have a significant amount of common land. It's mostly the agriculturally commercially valuable common land is in the uplands, so it's mostly livestock farming. And what you've got there is you've got governance structures that have been in existence for 800 years with what they call the hefting of flocks on upland commons, no fencing, and the sheep are basically trained to sort of stay in one area, and it's actually having lots of different flocks of sheep on an upland common, all that provide pressure that enable the whole area to be grazed very efficiently, and in fact, in terms of using that resource in an agricultural way, using it in common is far more efficient than if it was privatized. So yeah, it's the tragedy of the commons is often used in many instances where it's giving us an excuse for to enable somebody to enclose land. When actually it was just it's nothing to do with tragedy or disaster. But is that satisfying? Yeah, okay. I just wanted to pick up on the question about the length of time to register land. Why does it take so long? Well, I know I sort of rushed through the presentation, but if you noted, there's a little red box on one of the slides that said Commons Commissioners. From 1965, a group of commissioners was set up to deal with problems where there was dispute over rights or the boundaries of common land. And they thought, well, we'll set up these commissioners. They'll only run for 3 years, and then we can get rid of them. Well, they were there for 40 years, still dealing, after 40 years, with boundary problems, with conflict over rights. Partly it was because the Act itself had been rushed through, and the procedures that were set up were not properly designed. So you ended up creating far more problems than actually there should have been. So that was one reason.
So with that, I'd like to turn to Peter and Ileana to expand a bit more about why can companies get it through faster? Is it that they're putting more resources, or do they have an easier set of rules? And reflections on this.
Thank you, Ruth. I am going to lean on Ileana to provide the Peru context specifically, but maybe just some general comments. I mean, one of the so maybe first to Mark's question about institutions, and our finding was that there are some institutions, some government agencies that are involved in both the community and the company procedure, but there are also some unique institutions, and the real difference that we saw was that the government agency that's responsible for promoting investment, TIC, the Tanzania Investment Authority Center, or the Uganda Investment Authority, they are gold standards. They are fully supported. They maintain land banks oftentimes, and so they're well prepared to provide the land and the infrastructure that's necessary for investments to take place. And I mean, I see this almost as a race for land right now, a race for formal land rights right now. There's this huge push, obviously, for locking up land for economic development purposes. And on the one side, you've got communities trying to secure their customary rights, and on the other side, you have companies trying to acquire land. And it's much easier in many cases to acquire customary held land rather than formalized community land. And it's curious to me that the process of bringing established customary rights into the formal legal process takes longer than the creation of new land rights, which is what companies must acquire. So why is that? I suspect there's a lot of politics around that. The Tanzania procedure, I realized I didn't fully answer your question. Tanzania has one of the best land laws on the continent. And they actually have two laws. One is the village land law, and one is the larger land law that deals with general land and state land. And at the time they were established, there was a real strong push to empower communities and empower village governments specifically to take charge of the management of their land. What we're seeing now is that there is a process underway in Tanzania to try to pull back some of those nice features in the village land law. There's a new land policy that's in the works that will eventually establish, we think, a new land law, village land law. It will make it easier, I think, if it continues, the policy is finalized. It will make it much easier for the government to turn village land into general land, state control land. So it is, and Tanzania is not unique. I mean, years ago, Brazil, Bolivia had a real strong push toward formalization of indigenous land, and now you're seeing a slowdown and a stalling of that process. And there are lots of ways government can do it. In Brazil, for example, the main government agency is called FUNAI. Well, they've been, their budget has been slashed, and new steps have been added into the procedures of registering and formalizing community indigenous land. So it brings me to the larger point about, we really don't have very good numbers globally on this. We don't know how much land in the world is collectively held. The number of 50% of the world's land is always thrown around, but nobody knows. And people are beginning to question that 50%. And so I think there's an effort that needs to be started to actually document how much community land exists, whether it's under custom or under statutory law. We do know from a couple of years ago from some work that RRI did that 10% of the world's land is legally recognized as belonging to communities, another 8% designated for communities. We have no clue how much land, how much community land is titled, registered and titled. But I suspect it's a lot less than 10% of the world's land, which is just a fraction of the amount of community land that exists. Since we have the World Bank on our panel, the World Bank publishes annually the Doing Business, which, if you've taken a look at that, it's a great publication for investors. There is a part of the Doing Business that provides the number of steps and the cost for companies to acquire land. Now, most of this is rural, urban land. And I would love to see the World Bank expand on that and to add to that Doing Business the number of steps it requires companies to acquire rural land and the steps and the cost of communities to acquire titles as well. So we actually have a good baseline for this. But let me pass it over to Ileana.
Well, just to add to what Peter was talking about, but referring to Peru in this case, is that, well, in the case of Peru, I think at the Latin American level, that country is, one of the first that enacted laws that recognize indigenous rights at the country level. One of the best laws. It started in the 1970s. But I think that two issues are quite important when thinking about the question that you raised. Why is the process so long? And I think the first is, the political priority. And that is, you can see that in terms of the budget that is assigned to the entities in charge, which is extremely low, and the capacities that the government officers have to be able to implement this. And in the case of Peru, that's one thing. And the second is the existing social pressure that actually, in the absence of government support, which is the common basis in these cases, is that you continue to pressure the government to implement the law. So since the 1970s that Peru started with the process of formalizing native communities' rights, at least in the context of the Amazon, what we have observed is that you have had considerable changes in regulations. So you have from a constitutional law that recognizes almost full extent of the bundle of rights to continue reducing the type of rights that indigenous communities have been recognized during the last 40 years. That's one thing. And then also, you see a lot of changes in regulation, transference of competences within the government institutions. So for communities to understand to which government institution they need to go to be able to get their processes formalized, it's very difficult. But I have to say that in comparison to community cases, it's very similar. You still have a very high number of steps to be able to get the rights recognized to land for companies, but you have different resources, improved technical capacities from companies to be able to know where to go and what to do, but also other mechanisms to be able to pressure for creating other mechanisms to access land rights, which I think, at least in the level of Peru, makes a significant difference in terms of how these two groups are able to get rights to land.
Okay. Thea, did you want to come in on that?
Well, since there was a question by Peter, no, I think doing business is in that sense very interesting because, in a way, I would say it is read by ministries of finance, because too often I think the land question is only dealt with land agencies, and it goes around in circles. And don't forget about vested interest. I mean, there's partly what people believe things should be done, and we believe what is the right way of measurement surveying. I would say the political economy we did not discuss really, but there are reasons for why land values go up. There is indeed this thinking we all need land from urban and now go rural. Who are the people in parliament? So I mean, there is a reality out there. So doing business is helping to show certain things, but also it is again reductionist. So as again, like I said earlier, you have to make it simple but do no harm. So know what you ask. And I would say, yes, it is now very urban. It is now only for land which has a title and how long it takes to transact. So you see, it's not doing business, not even saying how long would it take to register urban land. You also don't want to know. It will be decades. I can tell you, it will be decades in a lot of places. So put in that request, and we're happy to do that. But if there is that, you need a demand from stakeholders. I mean, like civil society or client countries. That's how the World Bank works, and then we're most happy to work on that. And I mean, what was put on the table now by Peter is a very good starting point.
Actually, I think it could have a reverse effect, but I see one burning question there. We're at the end of our time. If you can make your questions quick, I can take two. But, okay, Mary.
Thank you. Blake Ratner. I lead an initiative within the CGIAR called Collaborating for Resilience. And just to connect together a few of these themes and bringing back the conversation to the beginning where you started, Ruth, around the metaphor that Garret Hardin put forward around the tragedy of the commons and linking that to population pressure. What I think hasn't been stated a lot, but the sort of the background behind the pressure on land resources that we're talking about has to do with the economic incentives that drive the need to go to even more remote places, to go beyond the domain of formally recognized private land rights as they exist now. And I was struck by the comment that that Thea made around the need to balance the functioning of these institutions with their legitimacy. And so my question is, what experiences can we identify that show promising gains in terms of moving towards the ability of commoners to be able to engage in these modern market institutions, to be able to engage in commercial enterprises, and yet retain the legitimacy that makes the commons function?
That's a lovely question and a nice theme. We don't have the time to actually give the answers to it here, but I will say if you go to the Policies, Institutions, and Markets website, under Flagship 5, we have some research on exactly that. What does it take to enable communities to invest rather than seeing investors as being the outside big private sector? And I think that's an important point, that the commoners themselves make the greatest investments in this that are of benefit for society at large as well. I apologize, sir. We are out of time, but you're welcome to stay and talk to our panelists. And thank you all very much. Thanks to our panelists for a really engaging discussion, and to all of you. And I hope you continue to think about these things for our common good. Thank you.